tell me the top 50 people in my organization that have the most privilege. And you can almost guarantee, and I'm sure you've had experience of this, is in most organizations, if they just ask that question, tell me the top 50 people or the top 100 people that have the most privilege, the answer when you see that is like, holy cow, who gave them all that access? And so the nice thing about a scaled solution as opposed to one of these more traditional solutions that's just kind of people reviewing things in spreadsheets or going through a GRC tool or going through something that's like human reviewing other humans' accesses. You need to be able to ask these questions like, who's got this privilege? Who's got the most access? If this credential is compromised, what's the chain of attack through the identity graph that could result on an action on a critical resource? All of that kind of stuff. I mean, one of the things that's fascinating, and Tarun knows this as much as anybody, is every customer use case of Veza. It's like every customer almost invents their new set of questions that are peculiar to their risks, that other customers can learn from in terms of, wow, that's a really interesting way of getting to the most risk and figuring out how to reduce that risk.
The time is here for us to really, not just lift one boat, and this is something I share with you and our teams. Let's not shift the boat, move the boat of visibility or move the boat of intelligence. Let's try to build something which we can lift all the boats together at a singular time. So whether it be IGA, whether it be PAM, whether it be NHI, we believe the fundamental of that is rooted in just completely rethinking identity from the scratch.
This is Identity at the Center. If it has anything to do with IAM, this is the go-to podcast. Now your hosts, Jim McDonald and Jeff Stedman.
Welcome to the Identity at the Center podcast. I'm Jeff, and that's Jim. Hey, Jim.
Hey, Jeff. How are you?
Oh, not so bad. Yourself?
I'm doing great. I'm super excited. We've got two of the top gurus in the identity security area today on the podcast. I'm ready to get into it.
Yeah, why don't we get into it? No use trying to wait and figure it out. If people read the title, they already know what they're in for. But again, to make it very clear, right? This is a sponsored episode. This is what gives us access to people like Tarun and Phil and others to really kind of dive deep into those technology conversations, especially when we start getting into product. So they have generously, spending their time with us and educate us on a few different things. But why don't we go ahead and get some introductions? So today we're sponsored by Veza, Veza. They're the identity security company. Totally stole that from their website, and we're going to hear more about what that means. But if you go to the website, veza.com/IDAC, veza.com/IDAC, we'll have some more information for you there. So with that, let me go ahead and introduce both of our guests today. We've got Tarun Thakkar. He's the co-founder and CEO of Veza. Welcome to the show, Tarun.
Very nice to be here. Thank you, Jeff and Jim. Appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, thanks for taking the time. And then he's joined by Phil Venables. He's a strategic security advisor with Google, and he's also a board director for Veza. So welcome to the show, Phil.
Yeah, great to be here. Looking forward to it.
So we have tradition around here that when someone joins us for the first time, is we like to find a little bit about their identity backgrounds and how they got in this space. Tarun, I'm going to start with you, and Phil, just get ready because you'll be next up in the wings. Tarun, how did you get into the identity space? Is it something that you chose, or did it choose you?
Yeah, no, Jeff, it's I remember talking about this question with you before when we met at Gartner IAM. It's definitely the latter. I don't come from the identity backgrounds. I've grown up in a distributed systems background, and spent the past 20 years of my career building distributed systems at scale. So, my background is definitely how to build systems at scale and how to think about, all the way from. I remember my first job was writing assembly language code to building globally distributed file systems and then globally distributed databases. So it's definitely the latter, but I would say, fascinated by this space 5 years in. I feel like identity has so much to be done that we're just barely scratching the surface. But thanks for asking.
Yeah, there's so much to do and learn in this space. I feel like I'm never going to get caught up. And I think that's a great thing because then it doesn't get stale.
Yeah. And also it feels like, identity is very much its own island, it's so critical, but yet, when you get into that space, it has its own, weird nuances. Maybe that's true for network security. Phil will probably know, and maybe that's true for endpoint security. But identity definitely has lots of threads here.
So I'm going to ask you about Veza here in a second, but I want to get to know Phil. Phil, this is the first time that we've met. I feel like we've been at a lot of conferences together. I've seen you speak. So I kind of feel like I know you a little bit, but at a distance. But now's my chance. Phil, tell me about your background. How did you get into the identity space? Is it something that you chose, or did it choose you as well?
Well, it's because I've been a CISO for 4 companies, 4 major global organizations over about 30 years. So I'm giving away my kind of my generation there, and every one of those CISO roles, as most people in security teams can imagine, it's hard to avoid thinking about identity and access management. It's, as I'm sure we're going to talk about today, it's one of the cores to security. But over many of those roles, over many years, it became a significant part of being able to just ask and answer the question: what are all the identities I should care about? What are all the things they can access? Is that access appropriate? And if not, what can we do about it? And then to do that at massive scale. And so, and Tarun knows this story because this is kind of how we first met. Is one of my prior organizations, I was really struggling to, and this is like a decade ago, really struggling to find any solutions that could help me solve this problem at scale. So we ended up building something, and we built it wrong first, learned from how not to build things at scale, and then built it at scale with a very similar architecture to what Veza has, although it had none of the sophistication, none of the bells and whistles. And if I'd have been around, if Veza had been around then, I'd have bought that solution because it was all of a scale problem. And so I've been immersed in this at the sharp end for decades. And it's so good to be partnering with Veza on their journey and just figuring out how we solve this in the right way.
So I have to imagine it was probably equal parts validating and frustrating that someone built what you built. And it's like, oh yeah, that's maybe better what we did.
I remember this, Jeff. This is 2021. I got introduced to Phil. This was like, we're only like 12, 14, 16 months old. And we just had very rough sketch MVP kind of ideas. And we started sharing with Phil that, hey, here is what we're thinking. Here is a graph. Here is access permissions. Here is how you bring it together. And Phil looked at it. It was a 30-minute introductory call. And that call, I don't know, Phil, if you remember, it ended up being a 2-hour call. And we talked about lots of challenges. And Phil is like, okay, let's see if we put our head down for 2 years. And we, had the opportunity to meet Phil again. And I remember 2023, and just so lucky and so fortunate, so privileged to have Phil on our board and guide us pretty much on a weekly basis.
So this is probably a good segue for people who aren't familiar with Veza. Tell us a bit about the company. What is it that you guys bring into the market? And then most importantly, and I'm going to put my jaded CISO hat on, is why are you guys different? Why are you guys, setting yourself apart? How do you set yourself apart from your competitors and things like that?
No, I think there are 3 questions packed in, Jeff, there, so I'll try to go fast. I think, look, with Veza, what we're building is really, what we call internally the next generation identity platform. We came to this conclusion, back to your question of, identity definitely choose us or me specifically. And I think the observation that we made on why we started this company, the insight and the intuition was, we were simply just asking questions, what I call the -1 journey of a startup before you actually found the company, which is what's top of mind. You said a CISO, what's top of mind when it comes to securing the biggest asset in your organization, which is your data, right? At the end of the day, if you're buying any tool, we're buying to really secure that asset. And the feedback was that, hey, look, we've solved lots of problems from endpoint to network to securing multi-factor, but we really haven't solved the hardest problem in identity, which was principle of least privilege. And so, essentially with Veza, what, as Phil noted, we started the company in 2020, 5 years old, really have taken that mission to heart on helping organizations really thrive towards the principle of least privilege, which is, in simple words, who's Jim and what can he delete in Snowflake, or who's Jeff and what can he delete in Oracle table. And so that's essentially what Veza started with. what we want to go build is our long-term vision, or Act 1, Act 2, Act 3 is really rooted in how can we build that next generation identity platform, which takes me to your question of differentiation, which was as we started digging into principle of least privilege, what became very clear to us is the world believes directory is an identity, and how fallacy that thought is, because that's not the truth. The truth is, the purest form of access is actually permissions and entitlements. And so we said, look, to back to your differentiation, the way we speak with CIOs and CISOs and CTOs is like, look, identity has to go beyond a directory service. We believe the purest form of identity is in permissions and entitlements. We have built this beautiful, what we call a durable data model, and data model, which is realized as access graph, really to help understand who are the humans and the non-humans, or even third-party identities, and what action can they perform on critical systems, whether it be SaaS, whether it be data systems, whether it be cloud systems, and now agentic AI apps. And so essentially our differentiation, Jeff, is really in that data model. We call it the access graph, which really brings the entitlements for that individual into this beautiful data structure, for lack of a better word, on which we have built lots and lots of apps. Visibility, intelligence, access reviews. We have built these apps on top of that data model to really, again, go solve business use cases and business problems.
So the other thing that is, you guys are making some news today, when this episode releases. Tell us a little bit about what's happening in the world of Veza.
Yeah, no, look, we as I noted, we've been very hard at work for the last 5 years. As Phil noted, we have had the fortune opportunity to partner with some very large Fortune 100, Fortune 10 organizations. It's become very clear, after partnering with such organizations across both enterprise and commercial, that we truly are solving a critical problem in cyber at large, right? Again, principle of least privilege. So, the time had come for us to really double down, triple down. Startups are all about product market fit. We feel like we have a great product market fit. And so, we're announcing today our Series D investment, over $108 million financing, which, doubles our valuation from the last time we did a Series C. And really this investment is very grateful to the new investors, NEA, and Aaron Jacobson and Hillary from the NEA team to sort of believe in the mission and the vision of the team, but also to sort of double down and triple down what could be what we believe could be a very, very long-lasting company.
Tarun, congratulations on that. And I'm glad you're finally on the podcast. We've had Rich Standulaker on a couple of times. Those have been some of our best episodes. And you mentioned how we bumped into each other at Gartner. And I've got to say, your booth, there were probably two companies that made the most noise at Gartner, and Veza was one of them. And your booth just constantly had people there. I mean, first off, your logos, even on your website, were out of this world. But I knew a lot of the people who were coming to your booth, and it was like super impressive. So congratulations, big time.
Thank you so much. Much appreciated.
I think it's, you're onto the right thing at the right time. Now, what do I mean by that? You're the identity security company, right? And so this is the time for that. That's what everyone's talking about. And there's good reason for that. And I'm going to actually turn this into a question for Phil. So identity security, it's like identity is front and center when it comes to security. And Phil, I wonder why is it that now this is hitting so hard?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think it's really to do with just the breadth of what identities and permissions and access and entitlements companies have to deal with. So they've got their traditional on-premise environment. They've most often got multiple cloud environments. They've got multiple SaaS services, some of which are big data warehouse services. There's a whole array of things now and coming with AI that has a whole series of human and non-human identities. So when you take a step back and you think about this problem, there's a set of human and non-human identities that have access to various resources, and organizations just need to answer the relatively simple question of what or who has got access to what, and is that appropriate, And is that actually implemented according to the intent that we have? Now, all of us and probably a lot of the audience today have, been in this battlefield of identity security for long enough to know that, just stating the problem quite simply like that, when you put that against the backdrop of the scale that even small to medium enterprises have to deal with in terms of their number of systems that contain access and privilege and identity and all of the external services, that you then need to just handle that at scale in a way that doesn't require manual reviews or tedious updates. You just got to manage this in an automated, systematic way. And to what Tarun was saying before, ultimately, and this is where a lot of organizations have failed in the past, if you don't architect this for the scale of trillions of combinations of accesses that can only be encoded in like an access graph like Veza have, then you're ultimately, even if you've got a great little system for dealing with a small number of privileges, ultimately is going to fail if you can't scale at kind of graph scale processing of the massive amount of combinations of accesses that you have to monitor adherence to, even in just the smallest of enterprises. And that's really, I think, what everybody's dealing with. And I think why, to your point, people are flocking to the booth at things like Gartner is they've tried solutions that don't scale, and they just need a solution that scales to cover all of their identity and access requirements. And that comes down to the data model.
Yeah, it definitely comes down to the data model. But you know what I really love what you said there, and this is what I love about you, Phil, is that you can take these big, difficult concepts and boil it down to something simple, right? And
So true.
yeah. So that is super cool. Tarun, what might you add to what Phil just said, if you can add anything?
Yeah, no. I think Phil is absolutely spot on. This whole Jim. Maybe I can just share a couple examples from organizations that we work with. Just sort of give some examples. We see sort of, to me, for lack of better word, these are sort of use cases, right? Who has access to what, and what can they do with that access is like number one in any organization, right? Whether it's a Fortune 500, Global 2000, or a commercial organization, right? So we see use cases sort of in the following order, Jim, just to give you some couple practical examples. Working with a very, very large financial organization, and their entire use case is about identity hygiene. And they're like, look, we have these users are about part of groups, and groups have roles, as Phil noted before, and roles are embedded within roles. Can somebody just demystify this and give us a very simplistic view on who has access to what role in, let's say, a system like Salesforce, right? Second, so one is very hygiene, identity hygiene, AD hygiene. Number two, an example of an organization like a Blackstone, right? There were a large Fortune 500 organization where they were doing all their access governance, their identity governance on spreadsheets. As Phil noted, there are not many people have cracked this problem, and so people are either living in PowerShell scripts, or they're living in Excel spreadsheets, or they're architecting their own solutions for organizations that can do that. And so Blackstone had architected a solution close together in ServiceNow, and we've completely transformed them in 3 years. There were about 500 apps. Think of a Fortune 500 organization configured on Veza for things like access reviews, things like access provisioning, deprovisioning. Give you another example of a large organization. Think of an Intuit, right? They are first of the 10 customers for us. And they're like, look, we love this access graph you have. We love this data model. Can you go and apply this to us to help us secure our GitHub? And we're like, why? Why do you want us to apply this to GitHub? And they're like, look, it's the biggest asset we have in the organization. All our code is in GitHub. And so all our IP is in GitHub. We cannot let it get into bad hands. And so we want to measure the permissions and the entitlements, who has access to it, and we want to keep driving what they called as over-permissioning access score. We need to keep driving that access score of over-permissioning down to 10%. So just a few examples to Jim to add to what Phil shared.
So this concept of least privilege sounds simple, but it is actually pretty hard to do in the real world. And this is how I know we got serious, Jim. Tarun took off his glasses. It's like, now we're really getting into like the deep end of it. Tarun, this is such a hot spot right now, is this whole concept of identity security, right? And obviously we're big fans of it here. You mentioned some of the issues that you typically see, and Phil, you mentioned some as well. It's kind of like why we're having this moment in the sun. But I'm curious, what do you see as like the biggest identity challenge today that you're seeing in organizations? Immediately, I think of things that are coming up this year that are also having a moment in the sun, like NHI, non-human identity. It seems like it's the buzzword at every conference. It's like everyone's kind of talking about. But I also think about it from a less technical standpoint of just the fragmented ownership of the way that organizations may typically be structured from like a governance perspective. You know, you'd be surprised how many organizations go into and say, so who's responsible for identity? And people don't know, right? Or it's fragmented and this person's responsible for this part of it and that person's responsible for that part of it. I'm curious if those examples make sense. Do you see additional challenges that are out there, and what should, you know, people be aware of and cognizant of? Say, okay, these are some of the challenges that other people are seeing as well.
Phil, you want to take that first?
Yeah. I mean, I think what's fascinating is again, it's this combinatoric explosion of all of the possible accesses. So, I mean, every time a new system is brought online, a new SaaS provider is signed up, a new cloud provider is signed up to, a new device is added, or it's just another set of identities. If they're not human identities, then the non-human identities you bring up. And then you add that, and then all of those things then connect to the human or the other non-human identities. All of them connect to resources that have various degrees of permissions, often to Tarun's point before, that are nested. Very, very quickly, this just explodes. And the ability to encode all this in a data structure like a graph doesn't just give you the ability to think about whether that is conformant at the scale of what any reasonable enterprise is. It lets you kind of pivot up and down the questions. So like, for example, you can say, you know, is this particular access appropriate? Or you could actually invert the problem and say, tell me the top 50 people in my organization that have the most privilege. And you can almost guarantee, and I'm sure you've had experience of this, is in most organizations, if they just ask that question, tell me the top 50 people or the top 100 people that have the most privilege, the answer when you see that is like, holy cow, who gave them all that access? So the nice thing about a scaled solution, as opposed to one of these more traditional solutions that's just kind of, you know, people reviewing things in spreadsheets or going through a GRC tool or going through something that's like human reviewing other humans' accesses, you need to be able to ask these questions like, who's got this privilege? Who's got the most access? If this credential is compromised, what's the chain of attack through the identity graph that could result on an action on a critical resource? All of that kind of stuff. I mean, one of the things that's fascinating, and you know, Tarun knows this as much as anybody, is every customer use case of Veza. It's like every customer almost invents their new set of questions that are peculiar to their risks, that other customers can learn from in terms of, wow, that's a really interesting way of getting to the most risk and figuring out how to reduce that risk.
No, absolutely. And Jeff, if it's okay with you, just to add to what Phil just shared, you know, you're absolutely right. First of all, non-human identity is definitely top of mind. Number one. Number two, you know, I'm here in Seattle meeting some of the large organizations, and you know, just today, just finishing a few discussions. You know, there are 4 use cases, you know, that come out every day that we hear. Number one, there is no centralized non-human identity store. So can you please help us just understand the access tokens and the service principals and the service accounts and even things like local users? Who gave, for example, Jim a local user in GitHub? Like, who did that, right? And finding that for. So that's number one. Number two that we're hearing on non-human is age of a non-human. When was the last time we rotated the key? And the third one is, you know, association of human to non-human, right? It's a very hard problem actually too, because non-human is many times, if not majority of the times, ephemeral in nature. And so, you know, Jim, for example, is in Active Directory. He spins up an EC2 instance, logs into a Cube instance, and wants to go access something. You know, if you think of, again, to the Phil's point of that chain of attack, which is what is top of mind of customers is like, look, who actually owns this non-human? Because we need to go and clean that relationship and figure out how do we get back to least privilege.
Yeah, and actually that's fascinating, because this is why I think it's important for identity solutions to deal with human and non-human identities together. One of the things, if you go back a few years, they were often somehow, and maybe still are today, different product sets. And one of the things I think Veza's done that's interesting is bring this together, because often when, as Tarun points out, when you're reasoning about a non-human identity, you're connecting it often to a human identity that has the control and ownership over a set of resources that are accessed by the NHIs. And I think it's they have to be managed together. And that's going to be even more important in a world of AI agents, where the humans are delegating privilege to agents that will act on their behalf, that will in turn interact with other non-human identities to fulfill goals on resources. And so this is going to be even more important to make sure it's a holistic management of identity and access governance and security.
So, Tarun, you know me. You trust me with standing privileges, right? I'm trustworthy.
No,
I don't want to hear about the zero trust.
No, we hear it. We heard few things right on those words. Zero trust is incomplete without principle of least privilege. And my deepest thanks to Phil. He's the one who helped us think through this very clearly, as you said, Jim. That's the pleasure of partnering with Phil. He says things in such a simple way. Number two, residual access and persistent access needs to go away. to your point.
That's right. It's what you just said there. And then when you think about the non-human identities,
yes.
And then, hey, look, as a practitioner, I've been a practitioner for over 20 years. You think, well I've got a toolbox. Mm-hmm. It's got XYZ tools in it. I'm going to choose from my tools to solve this problem. Mm-hmm. But the problem is different than what your tools were built to solve, right? And so when I look at NHIs, not literally, but I think about it and I'm like, okay, that seems the most like privileged access management. So maybe can I just throw a privileged access management tool at it? But so I have a question for Phil, because I think from a practitioner perspective, just thinking about privileged access management, it seems like the landscape is changing. Or maybe it's not. Maybe I'm thinking about it wrong. But it's always been notoriously hard to solve privileged access management. So I wanted to get your perspective on why is that so hard to do, especially at scale? Like why do the wheels come off when you try and do privileged access management in a large enterprise?
Well, it's interesting. It kind of touches on where we were going before, which is it's hard to unpick these identities these days. So like, if you go back, I don't know, 10 years ago and you talk about PAM, really what you're talking about is managing, say, root access on Linux servers, managing significant privileged accounts on Windows infrastructure, or managing SSH, credentials for significant privileged access. And I think the interesting thing now is when you look at how all of those privileges have been broken up into service account keys and machine credentials and all of this other environment, it's hard to distinguish between what's PAM and isn't PAM, because, it's all of beauty is in the eye of the beholder. It's like you could have something that's classically not PAM that suddenly becomes a very highly privileged account because the way you've overloaded the privileges onto it. And therefore, it just almost makes no sense anymore to have like a PAM solution and a non-human solution and a human solution and this solution. You've got to deal with it all together, because at any one moment, a historically non-privileged account could become a massively privileged account. And unless you're picking that up and controlling that as part of the whole identity graph, it's hard to stay ahead of that. And I think ultimately we've just got to think about identity and access security as it's the whole environment, and you ask sub questions of the identity graph that you've built up to let you control the whole thing, because otherwise you're just cursed to living in silos. And as we all know from brutal experience, sometimes personal experience, the attacks come in the seams between the silos, not full frontal onto your controls. And so having this pervasive view of everything is just absolutely critical.
Yeah, the through the seams. I like to use the analogy as the attacks are like water. They find the cracks. They find their way in. And then of course if you're in a cold environment, they get in and then they freeze and break up your foundation. And I think you're right. And I think back to some of the early days with Pam where you start getting into, well, are you DVR style recording your sessions? It's like, who cares?
Yes.
Right? And that's like,
yes.
oh,
Yeah, no,
Tarun, what do you add to that?
Yeah, no, I was going to take that word of recording. We used to live 10 years ago, maybe 15 now. We used to live in the world of, or we still probably live in the world of session recording and session management. But you go back to those customers and have those discussions with them. It's like, for what, right? And this architecture of going back to the, we have this point of view that at the end of the day, the architecture will sort of win at the end, which is, take an example of Snowflake, take an example of Databricks. You cannot go deploy an agent in a cloud native system like a Google BigQuery, right? And so who's going to do session management and session recording? My point, I guess, is Jim, privilege access in the cloud, or PAM in the cloud, or PAM for SaaS, or PAM for agentic AI is not going to have the architecture that we had before. I'm going to deploy a proxy in an Oracle server. It's going to record every action that I'm performing. That world is not going to be going forward.
That's right.
No, I mean, I think you're right on that, because we all know the immutable infrastructure patterns and the need for declarative controls of code, policy as code, infrastructure as code. One of the things I think, while there's still use cases for session recording and other things, they're typically seen in legacy environments where organizations have, for whatever reason, not been able to adopt these kind of immutable infrastructure patterns. And then when you've got those immutable infrastructure patterns, it even further highlights not just the need, but also the opportunity for least privilege, because then you're making sure that the site reliability engineers, the cloud orchestration engineers, the development engineers, the security engineers are all working on the same page to actually minimize the privilege that drives not just improvement in security, but also consequent improvement in reliability, because you're then minimizing privilege to force people through the immutable infrastructure pattern as well.
Correct. And Jim, I'll just say last thing quickly there. The same customers we speak to, they're like, look, we're buying a PAM solution because it says so in a NIST playbook or some form of a playbook, but nowhere it says you must do session recording. Nowhere it says you must do session management. It just says you must do privilege access. Well, that doesn't mean you have to do session recording. It could be simply credential vaulting, right? So it's I think that world of just back to identity, evolving very fast pace. Similarly, the world of privilege access is evolving at a very fast pace.
I'd like to get a little bit about Access Graph, because it's been mentioned a couple of times here. It's obviously secret sauce, I think, maybe a little bit for how this works. Tell me a little bit about Access Graph. What makes it unique?
Yep.
What can I see with it? What can I do with it? And then the bonus part of that question is, you mentioned least privileged earlier.
You're right.
So how do I use Access Graph to get to least privilege?
Yeah, no, I think those, thank you, Jeff, for asking. So I think, look, first with Access Graph, as Phil and I noted earlier, Access Graph is a manifestation of a data model, of the data structure, right? So just to zoom back and then we'll zoom in, you have entitlements everywhere. Phil has access to 30 different systems, let's say. So Phil has entitlements to 30 different systems. And so, applying a first principles thinking, if we truly want to answer the question, who can perform what action on what data, you just start breaking that problem down in first principles. Who comes from your identity systems, like an Active Directory, or an Okta, or a Ping, or a Duo, or pick your critical identity systems. And wherever Phil has access to, he belongs to certain roles. We used to have this framework called role-based access control. That paper, the seminal paper, was written in 1982, I think, of, if anybody needs access to a system, you go through what is called role-based access control. So, we said, okay, if we want to take who can take what action on what data, apply first principles, and that became the data model. And we call the data model. Not many people can understand data model, so we ended up calling it an access graph. But think of access graph under the hood is a data structure, a normalized, a canonical data model, which takes entitlements from 10 different unique systems and brings it down to a normalized data structure, right? So that's what an access graph is. Now you can imagine the art of innovation, the IP and the seminal innovation is, as Phil used the word combinatorics, right? A user belongs to a group. Well, you could belong to tens of groups. You have access to hundreds of systems. Every system could have 10 or different roles. Each role may give you M number of entitlements to perform to N number of resources, right? So if you think about in a classical computer science, you're thinking about a data structure where every element is to the log of scale, right? And so you're thinking about NP-hard problems. You're thinking about computational problems which are at a log or an exponential scale, right? So that's where our so-called the secret sauce, since you use the word, is how do you stream the data? How do you parse it? How do you store it in a data store? And how do you query it in near real time? Imagine that data set, right? I'll give you an example. Our access graph, only up till 18 months ago, Jeff, was 200 million nodes and edges. 200 million nodes and edges. Today, our access graph has 16 billion nodes and edges. And something Phil and I talk about all the time, at the pace that we're going, we'll have 100 billion nodes and edges in less than 2 years. So that, that problem is of cardinality, is the word we use. The problem is of very intelligent algorithms, graph traversal algorithms, and the intelligence is how to define the schema of the data model. So that's where our core of the IP, and we believe, speaking very humbly, we believe it's industry first. Something Jim said earlier, back to NHIs, if I can bring it here, and this security leader said it in a very beautiful words, Tarun, real problem, and I have no tool that can solve that problem. And this is like Fortune 100, actually Fortune 10. I want to know where my NHIs are. I have every tool in my toolbox, the PAM solutions, the IGS solutions, the IAM solutions, and I have no tool. And therein lies the opportunity, right? Taking that graph and applying it. And sorry, what was your second question, Jeff? I got passionate about that.
I think you covered all of it. I was curious, what is this thing? How does it work? And
I remember.
How that would work.
I remember your question. Sorry, yeah, I got your question of how to least privilege. So once you have that baseline of who has access to what, and again, there's something, Phil is coaching us. And once you have that baseline, is not enough. Phil is on our board, and so the other board members, they're like, you have to get into actionability very quickly. And so our Act 1. Very classical startup language. Our Act 1 was visibility intelligence, is working very well for us. And our Act 2, which we started about 18 months ago, is about actionability, access reviews. You define a baseline, you define a policy, and you monitor the deviation or a drift or a creep, and you do active operationalization on it. Right? Could be a ServiceNow ticket, could be a Jira ticket, could be a SOAR platform. Orchestration. So that's how we're in the process of sort of pruning the over-permissioning access.
I'm so interested in this topic of identity security. So if I could pull the conversation back to that and ask Phil,
yes.
Kind of from what he's seeing in his own organization, talking to his peers, I'm thinking about identity security, and okay, I'm going to start with my extra credit question, Phil. My extra credit question is it the identity practitioner who needs to change, adapt, learn new skills to do identity security, or is it folks in other areas of cybersecurity who need to learn identity? The other question is, okay, when you start to put together a program around identity security, like what are you driving toward in terms of key metrics, OKRs, KPIs? Like what is it that you want to show the organization that, hey, I talked to you about we're going to do identity security, assuming that's how you have the conversation. And we're going to spend
Yeah.
a couple $1 million. What do we get for that money?
Yeah, I mean, I think what's interesting about this problem is identity is in many organizations is kind of split up across various teams, and there's often very rarely is there consistent organization on that. So you may turn up at a bank and they've got like an identity security team inside the CISO function. You then go to a different bank and they've got it in the CTO or the support function. Then you go to a pharma company and they've got it in a different team. I think the main thing we're seeing though for most organizations is they recognize this has become such a challenge, or they did recognize it and they're now solving it. And essentially what they're doing is they're building this into their environment rather than bolting it on after the fact. And so a combination of the CISO and the CTO or CIO are driving an integrated identity and access governance process that's treating this as an enterprise-wide risk management problem that not only manages security risk, but it delivers transformational efficiency gains, because often in getting this right, they're reducing the need for dozens, if not hundreds, and in some cases thousands, identity and access administrators that are doing all this manually. And so this is one of those beautiful spaces compared to some other spaces in security where you can do security, productivity, efficiency, and save money all in one go rather than having to just increase all of them when doing security. And I think to your question about the metrics, one of the risks, though, with this, as I'm sure everybody knows, it's easy to drown in hundreds of different metrics on these things, and I like to kind of elevate this up. And now you do have to get to the detail, but at the simple level, though, success or failure for me of identity programs in, small, medium, and especially large organizations is really about three things. It's like, one is coverage. So what percentage of your universe of identities do you have under central management, or at least central visibility in a tool like Veza or something else? So that's coverage. And as you know, you could probably kill yourself nearly trying to get to like 100% coverage. So many of these things the goal may not be 100%. It may be 100% of your most critical systems, 70% of these other systems, and a long tail of other things to pick up. But it's important to understand where you're at on the percentage of coverage. Then once you understand the percentage of coverage, it's what's your percentage of adherence to enterprise policies. These could be least privilege policies. It could be privilege scoping policies. It could be RBAC, ABAC, separation of duties. But basically, once you've got all your coverage, you need to know what of those identities and access conforms to your enterprise policies. Now, the third and final thing is what you might call accuracy, which is, are those enterprise policies that you're driving adherence to, do they actually represent what your business risks are? So like, for example, you could have everything under control, everything under access management, and it looks great, but everybody's massively over permissioned because you didn't express your business rule according to your actual risk. So I think ultimately, if an organization just really understand where they're at percentage-wise on that journey to full coverage, full adherence, and then an accurate statement of whether your policies conform to your business risks. I mean, that's a decade worth of work there, but hopefully Veza makes that like 18 months or 2 years rather than a decade.
And Tarun, I'll follow up with you, and we got to make a quick answer here, because if we don't get this next question in, Jeff might up and quit, because I know he wants to talk about AI. But Tarun, can Veza basically provide the information that Phil just went over in terms of coverage?
Absolutely. No, we've taken that construct of access policy, and a set of access policies, and we have codified. So meaning the user journey. To simple answer to your question, the user journey that we aspire to give is you connect Veza to your 5 or 10 critical systems, and we want to give you very quickly those access policy risks, right? And they are baselined against a least privilege risk, an over permission risk, a non-human identity risk, a global admin risk, that you can then go act very quickly, Jeff, to your point of least privilege.
Okay, so I'm glad Jim is giving me just a minute to ask an AI question. And Phil, I want to turn it to you because I'm curious what you think is going to be the biggest impact that AI, and specifically maybe generative AI, is going to have on an identity security practice. What should people be listening for when it comes to these are impacts we should be aware of?
Well, I think it's two things. It's opportunities and risk, just like with most things to do with AI. So first on the opportunity side, I mean, I think the use of AI tooling to analyze large amounts of data to be able to translate human expressible policies into machine readable code that can help you manage your access policies. We're just seeing that all the time. And it may not even just be things like large language models to help with that. One of the nice things about having an access graph data model is this technology like graph neural networks that let you look for anomalies of access and clustering of privilege that may be anomalous at graph scale. And so there's a lot of opportunities to apply AI to help people productively manage the risks associated with all of their complex privileges. On the flip side, though, one of the things we're seeing, and I'm sure everybody's starting to kind of project this forward, in a world of AI agents acting on behalf of people or behalf of systems, we're going to see an even bigger amount of non-human identities associated with agents, identities associated with back-end systems. And we're again just about to see an explosion over this year and the coming years on the amount of AI agents that individuals have, that companies have, that systems have. And it's again things like the model context protocol standards that came out late last year from Anthropic that many companies are adopting, provides this standard layer by which services can implement accessibility and connectivity from AI agents is going to even further add to that. One of the things that's going to be fascinating is on things like MCP, the Model Context Protocol. There's much work still to be done on identity, access, and authentication in that layer. And I think that's where a lot of solutions are going to be needed. And again, like we talked about before, you can't really think about that as a unique solution just to manage AI identities, because it's so intrinsically embedded. For example, if you have an MCP server that's going to connect to a tools API gateway that's a bunch of non-human identities, you can't all of a sudden have an AI, privilege management system that has no concept of all the other non-human identities. It would be yet another silo like we talked about before. And so positioning an environment where you've already got your human identities, your non-human identities, to add into the mix your AI agent identities that act as delegated permissions from your human identities or your system non-human identities, having that in the mix and the graph is going to be important. And if you can't scale that, the scale of AI agents is just going to be, off the charts even compared to where we're at today. And I don't think there's many solutions out there, particularly the ones that haven't built for this scalable graph, that are going to be able to cope with that.
So I think that MCP, or Model Context Protocol, is one of the more important developments to come along, because otherwise we run into the risk of data silos again, which is kind of where we've been. It's almost like, that group, and I'm going to simplify it for my feeble brain, and we're going to have to do a whole separate episode on this, but it's almost like you're developing a standard for how should these AIs talk to each other. Can they speak the same language? It's like USB. Everybody uses a USB port, or it's like OAuth or SAML or something like that, right? Where there is a common way to talk to each other, which I think is hugely important to be able to share information back and forth. So I am totally all in to have a conversation about that, but I want to pitch the last question to Tarun, and this is my AI at the center question. Where is Veza at from a AI perspective? How are you guys leveraging it? What is your overall look forward on how you see this impacting your organization and your product?
Yeah, no, thank you, Jeff. I will try to again keep it quick. Having somebody like Phil on the board, sort of helping us think through N+2, N+3. We launched a brand new product called Access AI. Phil is a big proponent for me and my co-founders to be thinking about those things very early. So we launched, Jeff, to your question, we launched Access AI which is our generative AI solution. Again, if you go back to the fundamental question that we're trying to answer, who can take what action on what data? Imagine that as natural language. Imagine that what you do on ChatGPT and prompt engineering based, right? So we launched a new product. It was geared. The first app that we built on Access AI is for search. So now you can come and ask a question. My AD user whose location code is in China, can they access data in Salesforce, right? Access AI allows you to ask those data sovereignty questions, right? And so the next, so we're building apps on top of Access AI. It's built on top of Bedrock. You can imagine all the good things that enterprises care about. The next app we're thinking, of course, is we have now customers saying that, look, you've done so much for access reviews. Approve and reject. I have access to something. Can Jane approve my access or not? And they're like, can you apply Access AI where if I get a quarterly access review, I hit the Access AI button, it tells me from the 100 entitlement reviews I have to do, I only have to pay attention to the 5. Again, filter for, signal and noise. So it's a really good product. It's a new beginning for us. And now if you think of the agentic AI, Jeff, with what Phil was sharing earlier, now we're going into the world, we get a notification, now we can respond to it, right, with agents versus just a notification that you're running late for a meeting. Now you can start to talk to it. And if those two agents, the only common entity, the only common attribute is actually permissions and entitlement. So we're actually very fascinated. I'll even spill some beans. Just 3 weeks ago, 4 weeks ago, when we met with Phil, he encouraged that, look, this is going to be such a transformational, seminal force that you should perhaps think about, setting up subsidiary and just heads down focusing on Access AI. That's the focus that will be needed. So there's something on that maybe in the future, how much we're going to embrace, by putting our focus and team around it.
It's clear that there is so much more room for innovation at this point, and I love what you guys are doing. And I'm a big fan of the AI stuff. So things that make our lives easier are things that I'm interested in. And there are so many people out there that are still spending their time poring over spreadsheets. Phil, here's a list of 500 people who have access to this weirdly named Active Directory group that nobody knows what it does, and it's nested in underneath 4 other different things. Hey, Phil, does that look right to you? And Phil, no offense to you, you don't know what you're looking at, right? So I think there's a huge opportunity to humanize the way identity is done, and I love what you guys are working on. So it's super cool. I know we're running out of time, but I want to give Tarun and Phil one last chance here. Any final thoughts you want to take with Tarun? I'll start with you, and then we'll end with Phil.
No, Jeff and Jim, thank you so much. Been wanting to do this together, and it came together very well with Phil. Thanks for really an exciting conversation. And I would say, the time is here for us to really, not just lift one boat. And this is something I share with you and our teams. Let's not move the boat of visibility or move the boat of intelligence. Let's try to build something which we can lift all the boats together at a singular time. So whether it be IGA, whether it be PAM, whether it be NHI, we believe the fundamental of that is rooted in just completely rethinking identity from the scratch. So again, very grateful for the opportunity, and I'll give the baton to Phil to help close.
Yeah, I mean, just to build on that, I mean, I think we've covered a lot of this as we've gone through the session today, but just really encouraging everybody to just think about this problem more simply and in bigger terms, like thinking of it as a simple way of, where all your identities are, you understand all of the resources they can access, do you have a record of all of that? And everybody, of course, knows they should be doing that. And then when you look at the reasons they've not done that, it's because of complexity, it's because of scale, it's because certain systems couldn't be brought together. And one of the things I think, the Veza team have done such a great job on is figuring out the technology and the secret sauce for how to bring all of that together so that all different types of identity problems and access problems and management problems can be solved from the same structure. And that's why I'm very optimistic about the challenges of managing the even bigger set of AI identities and connecting them to that access graph is going to be so critical. Fundamentally, this is the scale problem, and being able to interrogate that access and understand the adherence and the policy conformance at the scale that organizations actually work, as opposed to the scale of some old legacy system that could only deal with like a hundredth of it.
Now is the time, as Tarun was saying. So with that, I thank you guys for spending some time with us, and we'll have links in our show notes for people to check out, both for both your LinkedIn, but as well as to learn more about Veza, veza.com/IDAC, VEZA. And Phil, I'll put a link to your blog as well, because you're a prolific contributor to the body of knowledge that we have in the identity space. So.
All of us wait on Sunday morning to read Phil's blog. At least I do.
All right. So with that, we'll go ahead and leave it for this week. Thanks everybody for watching and or listening. You can find us on the web, idacpodcast.com. Share this with your friends, like and subscribe to all that fun stuff. And we'll talk with everybody in the next one.
Jeff, thank you so much.
You've been listening to Identity at the Center. We hope you've enjoyed the show. Make sure to like, rate, and review. And we'll be back soon. But in the meantime, hit the website at identityatthecenter.com. See you next time on Identity at the Center.